Says the host.
Good afternoon. I am Lauren Bloomberg, and I am the director of the Holocaust Education Resource Organization of Buffalo. And I'm joined by my treasured colleague, Wendy Weisbrot, manager of HERO, as well as our devoted second generation descendants, part of our Speakers Bureau. We thank you for joining us today for the second installment of What History Teaches: The Rise of Nazism. This program is presented in collaboration with Holocaust centers and museums across North America, including Alabama, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Illinois, Los Angeles, Montreal, and Seattle. Together, we share a profound responsibility to learn from the lessons of the Holocaust and use its lessons to inspire action. A special thank you to Lisa Brockman and Haley Wells of the Alabama Holocaust Education Center for facilitating this webinar. We are honored to welcome esteemed professors emeriti Dr. Larry Jones of Canisius University and Dr. Dean Pavlakis, Carroll College, as they present the rule of law and the erosion of democracy. Dr. Jones is an internationally recognized expert on the Weimar Republic, and Dr. Dean Pavlakis is a leading scholar in modern European history. We've allotted time at the end of the presentation for questions, so please put them in the chat for them to be answered. Thank you.
Let's see. It's juggling the shares.
Change the camera, right?
Yes, please. Oh, let me get that. See how that works. Okay, I think we're visible now. Thank you very much, Lauren. We need to start our discussion with a description of what our subject today is, the rule of law. You could think of the rule of law as a general agreement that persons and institutions, especially the government, will adhere to laws and regulations that are developed following a widely agreed upon process. The implications of this is that the laws are legitimate and therefore deserve wide support, and that the laws apply to everyone. When you talk about Germany, or specifically here, the Weimar Republic, we're talking about a system of government that was established in the wake of a revolution that overthrew the previous form of government, which was the Second Empire. That empire had been created by Bismarck. It was a federation of independent states that came together to serve some sort of a common purpose. But in the last days of 1918, those institutions were swept away by a revolution that began in the northern part of Germany and spread south. So virtually every state in Germany had been engulfed by revolution. They sat down to develop a new constitution in a small city called Weimar, and the constitution they created gave birth to what was known as the Weimar Republic, a system of government that lasted roughly from 1919 to 1933. The problem facing this, however, was that the Republic was not universally accepted by all Germans. And that is particularly true in the legal and judicial professions, who had been trained in conservative legal theories and it meant from the very beginning, the Weimar Republic and the Constitution upon which it was founded, it suffered a sort of a legitimacy crisis. Certainly, certain elements of German society supported the Republic, and in some cases enthusiastically. But on the other hand, it was rejected by a very large percentage of the population, which I would say would be someplace between 30 and 45% at the time that the Republic was founded. And the situation going on in the background is that Germany is in chaos. As Larry mentioned, the old established authorities had been swept away. The Kaiser had abdicated. A new constitution was written by an elected body, but nonetheless a small group of people very hastily in the city of Weimar. The other thing to keep in mind is that this chaos in government is reflected throughout the economy and society. There are widespread strikes. There's essentially a civil war going on as various leftist groups attempt to impose their own view. And these leftist groups are crushed by the army and primarily by a merciless set of paramilitaries. So we have economic chaos, we have political chaos, and social chaos, complicated by the fact that many Germans did not believe Germany had actually lost the war. The propaganda had said Germany was winning, and in fact, in the East, they had been triumphant. In the West, however, the Allies were poised to invade the country, but had not yet. Germans, confronted with this sudden treatment as a loser in this war, came up with various conspiracy theories about a stab in the back, directed initially primarily at the Social Democratic Party, which is the main prop and support of the Weimar Republic, but ultimately encompassing many others as well, including the 1% of the population in Germany that was Jewish. Larry, do you want to talk a little more about the economic
Yes, I would like to
challenges?
talk about the economic situation. I think that is the key to understanding what is happening in Germany as a rule. As a result of the war and the defeat, Germany suffered from an acute shortage of capital. That was its basic economic program. Okay. And during the war, Germans had financed the war by issuing war bonds. I think there were 8 separate campaigns in this regard, beginning in 1915 and carrying through right to 1918. I have one of those here. This is a little story on this is actually one that my great grandfather bought in 1915 for 1,000 marks, which at that time was an awful lot of money. Okay. That would be roughly the equivalent to $250 in 1915, and you could imagine what that might be today. The problem was that all of that was based upon the assumption that Germany was going to win the war, and then they could repay these debts without stressing anybody in the economy. They would have actually acquired territories and new wealth that they could use to pay this debt. Well, that didn't work out, and so my great grandfather, who was at that time living in Wisconsin, saw his money simply evaporate. And that happened on a national scale. Just to give you an idea, and it set in motion one of the worst inflations in history of the world, for that, maybe the worst. Let me give you an idea of exactly how bad it was. In 1914, when World War I broke out, $1 was equal to 4.1 marks. I mean, then a mark was about a quarter, a little more than that. When the inflation came to an end in November of 1923, the value of what would a dollar would have bought, what it would take to get a dollar, was 4.1 times 10 to the 12th power. That means that the mark was devalued to about 1/1,000,000th of its original value. Now, who bore that debt? Obviously, the people who bought war bonds, but the magnitude of that has spread far throughout all sectors of the German economy. Eventually, in 1923-24, they came up with a new currency called the Rentenmark that provided short-term stability, and that enabled the government to redo everything. But all of that money that had been lost during the inflation was gone. That was wiped out. And so Germany no longer had its own capital to expand or to recover, to rebuild its economy, and had to rely upon foreign loans from the Allies of all people. And there were 2 major loans here. One was incorporating the Dawes Plan in 1924, and then the Young Plan in 1929. In each case, as the Allies attached conditions to this money, conditions which those people in Germany who didn't believe that Germany should have lost the war or anything like that, which they bitterly, bitterly resented, and made that very difficult, impossible for them to accept the Republican system of government, which Germany had established in 1919.
And part of the problem, Larry, if I remember correctly, is that all parties felt that these treaties and the impositions of Versailles and the Dawes Plan were unfair and what they would have liked to have gotten out from under them. But some of the parties, particularly the ones that supported the Republic, followed a policy they called fulfillment, which is we don't like it, but we're going to get along with everybody by playing along. And the others felt they had a policy of resistance, which meant not only resisting the Allies, but resisting the government. Would you say that's correct?
To a point, there was it was, first of all, a multi-party system. There were perhaps as many as 4 or 5 parties at the beginning of the Weimar Republic, but more. But one of the problems was the fragmentation of the party system. More and more parties came into existence over the course of time. But the key player here was the Nationalist Party. This was the party of national opposition. It was called the German National People's Party, and it opposed the Weimar Republic very strongly, particularly in the period from 1919 to 1924. There was a moment maybe in 24 when it would have gone. I don't want to get into the details of that, but as a result of its opposition to the Republic, the party grew stronger and stronger. They felt justified in the political line that they were taking. And the big problem as I look at politically, and I'll put it in these terms, once you get 1924 is sort of like a new start. The inflation is over, foreign capital is coming in to help Germany rebuild the economy, and the political system deal with all of this. And what we have between 1924 and 1933, when Hitler takes power, is the progressive narrowing of options, political options. There are a number of ways they explore. Not between 1924 and 1928, the pro-government parties, pro-Republican parties are trying to bring the nationalists into the government. And there's two attempts in 25 and then into 27 when the nationalists enter the government. Okay, but the problem that was is that cost the nationalists at the polls. Their own supporters begin to go to splinter parties because they can't trust them to fight for the national cause. Okay, and this continues, and then obviously the disintegration of the Weimar party system was greatly accelerated by the inflation, by the depression, which hit Germany with full force in 1929. Eventually, the depression in Germany far worse than it was in the United States, which was very severely affected as well. But in Germany, it was so bad that you had 1 out of every 6 worker was unemployed as a result of it, had a much higher unemployment rate. And under the pressure, the political system, the political parties began to fragment, fall apart. There were 2 exceptions to this. Okay, one was the Social Democratic Party, where it began to suffer some losses to the communists. The other one was the Catholic Center Party, which of all of the political parties in Germany was the one that was most loyal to the Weimar Republic. But by that time, neither the socialists nor the center, which were willing to work together with each other, commanded anything close to a parliamentary majority.
And I think we've got a moment to talk about how with the depression damaging the party system, what we fall into is a pattern where the president, Paul von Hindenburg, a duty-bound supporter of the Republic who nonetheless was very nostalgic for the old days, was appointing chancellors not who could command that parliamentary majority, but chancellors who he had some confidence in and backing them, and therefore had less legitimacy. We run into this issue of legitimacy being undermined right from the beginning, right with the nationalists saying that the republic had to end. We talked about the rebellions on the left. There were also attempts on the right in those early years to overthrow the system and replace the government. And now, with the Depression, you've got a parliamentary system that is non-functional. And this is a good moment to bring up, whoops, we skipped your posters.
That's all right. That's all
Right.
I show these basically so you get some way in which the nationalists portrayed themselves. In this respect, it says German women, wake up, do your duty, okay, vote for the German nationalists. And the fact of the matter is that German women, by and large, voted in the socialist parties in much larger number than they supported the right-wing fascist parties.
Make sure we're split. Can you see us?
Yes, yes, we can't see her.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
This is simply another one. The wording up there says we hold strong to prayer, and it appeals to the religious, particularly the evangelical Protestant Germans.
Can you guys reshare? You have to reshare the.
I don't know. I
can this. Okay.
share. Share. Okay.
Okay, well,
Good. And then
Okay.
one more. Or two
Yeah.
more.
this was from 1929. The German government had negotiated what was called the Young Plan with France and Great Britain, and that would obviously provide some of the capital that Germany needed to continue its economic recovery. But as you can read up here, the Young Plan German repayment of the money that they received under the Young Plan was to go for 60 years. And it says still 60 years caught in chains. Don't pay to pay tribute means to go under. And that is part of that campaign. They launched a national campaign. It didn't do very well. It went in two stages. In the first stage, it got 10.2% of the signatures of all German voters, which was hardly an impressive performance. But that was 1929. That was before or just as Wall Street laid its egg, and set in motion this series of events that were worse. So the problem that was so bad in Germany is that Germany had no real capital to fight off the consequences of what had happened in Wall Street.
Okay. So in addition to all the criticisms of the government that were made for cooperating with the Allies and for mismanaging the economy and for struggling to deal with the Depression, there were two structural things that started very soon after the Republic was founded that undermined the rule of law. And that was because the parliament seemed inadequate to deal with these problems. The first tool was Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which said that the president could rule by decree in times of emergency. By definition, an individual ruling by decree is not the rule of law, right? It conjures up images of Tsarist Russia And it subverts the legislative process. Weimar had a lot of emergencies. We've only talked about a few of them during these years. And therefore, before 1925, Article 48 was invoked dozens of times. And then it accelerates again after the Depression starts, when the Chancellor does not have the parliament behind him and turns with increasing frequency to the president to take care of all kinds of routine business. And the article was invoked about 60 times in 1932 alone. The other method wasn't even spelled out in the Constitution, but was invented while they were writing the Constitution and still having to deal with emergencies in the country. And this is called enabling acts. In these times, the Parliament would pass an enabling act that granted the power of the legislature to the Chancellor and the Cabinet for a defined period of time, typically a few months, to avoid the sausage making of legislative work. Process wasn't spelled out in the Constitution. Each enabling act, sorry, we've lost our share again. I don't know how that happens.
Maybe it.
Each enabling act is essentially an ad hoc temporary amendment to the Constitution, requiring a 2/3 majority to pass and 2/3 of legislators to vote. It will not surprise you to learn that Hitler used an enabling act 2 months after coming to power to transfer all the powers of the legislature to his cabinet, including the power to violate the Constitution, which is unconstitutional, for a period not of a few months, but of 4 years. And it is the use of Article 48 in the first month after he became Chancellor, and the Enabling Act, both of which had histories in Weimar. The use of those two tools allowed Hitler to very rapidly create a personal dictatorship. Okay. And so this, there we go, paves the way for the Nazi dictatorship.
Okay, I don't want to go into great detail right here. Here you see some of the campaign posters that they used in 1932. The first one is very easy to identify because Hitler would fly across the country in the campaigns. There were 2 major electoral campaigns in 32, one in July, late July, and the other one in November. And Hitler would fly throughout Germany. The other one has said something about there was an appeal to vote for the front soldier, Adolf Hitler, brains and strength to go together, or something like that. Appeal to the German working class. I want to say a couple of things here that are important. Myself, I do not believe that somehow Hitler's appointment as chancellor was inevitable. It was the result of certain decisions that were taken by various players in the political process. I talked earlier about the narrowing of options, of political options. And certainly by 1932, it would seem as if most of the democratic options had already been exhausted. I could explain that in more detail. It has to do with parliamentary politics, and I don't want to bore you with that right now. The next option in 1930 was the option of government by enabling act. And the man here was not a fascist, not a Nazi. He was Heinrich Brüning. He was a very highly respected member of the German Center Party, which was a party that was committed to preserving and protecting the Weimar Constitution. Brüning realized, however, that given the magnitude of the economic crisis that Germany faced, parliamentary system could not function. the schisms within the parliament were so strong and powerful that he could not count upon them to give him any sort of parliamentary majority. And so he resorted to Enabling Act, to Article 48, to institute his governmental program. Okay. The problem with that is that Brüning was a fiscal conservative, and he didn't have the sort of Keynesian imagination that would have taken to use government funding and other resources to get out of the economic crisis. So the consequence of his policies only magnified the economic crisis that the German people were already experiencing as early as 30, but then through 31 and 32, when unemployment continued to reach almost unimaginable heights. Now, next stage, Brüning falls from power in 1932. He was in power for over 2 years and did quite well given the conditions that he was struggling with. Now, what does Germany do? And this is where it becomes, let's say, very iffy. The key player in the last 6 months of the Weimar Republic, say for second half of 1932, was a German general here in uniform, Kurt von Schleicher. Kurt von Schleicher. Not a friend of the Nazis by any means. He was eventually killed by the Nazis in 1934. So he was not, but he had to find something. He wanted to keep Germany out of a civil war. He knew that the Reichswehr, limited in size to 100,000 men, soldiers, would not be able to intervene effectively if civil war broke out. So he's desperate to prevent that from happening. And he supports somehow the man in the middle, Franz von Papen. And Franz von Papen is probably, it was sort of almost a last minute choice. In May of 1932, Schleicher says he was looking for someone he could count on. And Papen sort of presented himself here, and he knew he knew Hindenburg personally. He had been an officer in World War I. He had even been the German consul in the United States for a while. But Papen is politically untested and ultimately unreliable. He's appointed chancellor in the summer of 1932, continues for about 5 or 6 months, falls from power, and is succeeded by Schleicher.
And isn't Papen's goal to destroy the Republic? He's one of the.
He doesn't, whether it's his goal or the Republic is dead anyway right now. It's gone. You're not going to put the Republic back together. And so it's a question of figuring out what sort of options are going to work best for the German people. And he's an extremely vain person. Schleicher realizes in November of 1932 that he can't do anything with this guy. And so he cuts him loose. And he's forced to resign as chancellor because of an embarrassingly bad vote of no confidence in the Reichstag. Schleicher succeeds him. Papen, now in his efforts to get even with Schleicher, enters to an alliance with Hitler, who is also now the leader of the largest party in Germany with 190 some deputies in the German parliament. And eventually Papen enters into a deal with Hitler that leads to Hitler's appointment as chancellor on January 30th, 1933. It didn't have to go that way. There were a lot of different variables that play a role in this. And I don't think that was the inevitable outcome of Germany's crisis. It could have been avoided, but it wasn't in large part because of some bad choices and decisions that were made in the last 6 months, 2 years of the Weimar Republic.
And I think, to your point, the Republic was dead in all but name. before Hitler's appointment. So something was going to happen. It was not going to go back to what had been. And what that means is that the notion of the rule of law, and the rule of law had a long history in Germany, right? That's as an important theory, even under the Kaiser, right? A state of laws, not of individuals, except the Kaiser. And now the rule of law has essentially been thrown aside for this purpose. So the result is the Nazi movement. Weimar democracy had been so damaged by these crises and the response to the crises that it was not going to survive, and it paved the way for the very rapid development of the Hitler dictatorship. Anything else to add on?
No, but I think in general, when you talk about Hitler's cabinet, the cabinet he formed in January of 1933 was not Nazi cabinet. There were only three members well, I suppose there were only three people in the cabinet who were Nazis. Hitler, so the rest of the positions in that cabinet were held by conservatives. And so certainly you have to focus on conservative complicity in the formation of the Hitler cabinet in 1933. And Hitler would use conservatives very easily for his own goal. But generally, over the course of time, he got rid of them and pushed them to the sidelines, or in Papen's case, sending to Austria to be the ambassador there, and things that, and so the conservatives who had helped Hitler in power found themselves really pushed more and more to the sidelines, where they had very little influence over what was happening.
All right. So I think that wraps up our prepared remarks, and we can open it up to questions
from the audience. No? Okay. So the first question was, I don't understand why 1924 was the end of a terrible inflation. How did that work?
Well, I think Larry gave a quick summary that made sense. Really, what you needed to do was to create confidence in a currency that was not going to constantly lose value. And they did it in two steps. The first, the creation of the Rentenmark. So you had to come in. I don't know how many zeros they chopped off.
They chopped them off. They went back to pretty much what it had been before. So the difference was the German currency wasn't tied to anything in particular. The Rentenmark was tied to the value of German land. So it gave it a stable root or basis foundation. And while it didn't last for long, it gave German legislators the opportunity they needed to basically put Germany back on some sort of an economic footing, knowing they didn't have the capital they needed, knowing they would have to go through Germany's former enemies and the United States to get the capital they needed.
So hopefully that helped answer that question.
Okay. Please explain the role of president versus chancellor in the Republic.
Okay. So and this is true in many European countries today, where there is a head of state who is either a president, or in the case of Britain, the king, and a head of government. So the president is the head of state, and the chancellor is the head of the government, the prime minister. But unlike, say, in Germany today, the president's role in the Weimar Republic was designed to have much more power. So the armed forces reported not to the chancellor, but to the president, for instance. And the president had this rule by decree power that is not available to most of these presidents in parliamentary systems today. Hopefully that helps.
So let me just add a bit to that. The president was elected by popular vote. Okay. The chancellor was elected or chosen by a vote of the legislature. of the lower house of the House. Okay.
Well, appointed
Appoint-
by the president,
Oh, yes.
typically the leader of the
Yeah.
largest party.
Yes and no, but but the other thing to point out here is that the first president of the Weimar Republic was a socialist, right? Very high, Friedrich Ebert, died suddenly in 1925 of a ruptured blood vessel. Okay, he was succeeded by Hindenburg, and when Hindenburg, he was elected by the popular vote, not by an overwhelming margin, but a respectable majority. And he took a pledge to serve the Weimar Constitution. And for most persons, Hindenburg held to that pledge. He held it. He kept that pledge. All right. And it was not until the situation in Germany became so desperate that he began, or the people around him began to think of some sort of alternatives way of governing Germany. By 32, I think they had lost their faith in democracy, and they were trying to look for something new.
Okay. Was Hitler involved with the Weimar Republic? What was the Weimar Republic to the Nazis?
The shame, a sign of shame, eternal shame. Hitler was not, if he was involved in the Weimar Republic, not in any sort of a positive way, because I think he was committed from the time he entered politics in 1919 until he became chancellor. He was dedicated to the overthrow of the Weimar Republic, and he held it responsible, Germany's weakness militarily, economically, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. President Hindenburg wasn't discussed much. How much did his personal ambitions or actions influence Hitler being named chancellor?
Well, that's a very good question. Very good question. And historians debate that. I mean, it's still there's still a lot of differences of opinion on that. My own sense of it is that Hindenburg was a person who took his oath to the Weimar Constitution seriously and tried to live up to it the best he could. He had, however, he was surrounded by a sort of conservative entourage who, when the opportunity presented itself, began to use their influence with the president to undermine his willingness to remain, according to the Constitution, and all of that.
If I can just give a
Yeah.
little story in the middle of your explanation. The July 1932 elections, the Nazis came out the largest party. So in a parliamentary system, Hindenburg should have invited Hitler to form a government, and he refused to do it. And Hitler insisted, and he brushed him off. He said that he was unsuited. There's some snobbery there, his lower class background, but also his willingness to use violence to achieve his ends. Hindenburg was on the record as saying, I'm not going to ask him to do it. Now, in January, of course, that changes.
Well, it changes, yes. But keep in mind that the person that Hindenburg picked for Bruning's chancellor was von Papen, who was as close to a political idiot as you can come.
Okay. One person asked, can you go back to the previous slide showing where Hitler's support came from?
Oh, they saw me flip by that. That's some extra slides. Hold on. To do the share. But Larry, you can start talking about that while I'm pulling the slide up.
I think you can say that his support came from virtually every sector of German society, with the exception of the working class. The working class was loyal either to the Social Democratic Party, which in 1933 was the second largest party in Germany, or the German Communist Party. And socialists who were radicalized didn't go to the Nazi Party, they would go to the Communist Party if they made any move whatsoever. But the Social Democratic Party remained fairly stable throughout the entire history of the Weimar Republic, except it began to lose some support as a result of of depression, primarily not to the Nazis, but primarily the communists.
Hitler was jailed for a time and had a replacement take over who was Lutheran from Belarus in charge of the Ukraine area. A document diary was found recently and disclosed at the Holocaust Museum in DC, where the jailing of Hitler the cause for more horrific events when Hitler left jail.
There's several things to point out here. One, Hitler didn't have it bad in jail. He was taken to a fortress, Landsberg, where he served his time. He had his guests or visitors anytime. Party leaders or people who had served him would come and meet with him in prison. So it was hardly anything. Then the second thing, he was sentenced originally to 5 years. Out of that 5 years, he only served 9 months. And that was because the new prime minister of Bavaria, the state in which Hitler tried to overthrow the government, that's where it began. He decided he would issue a sort of a general amnesty on political prisoners. And so he's a member of the Bavarian People's Party, which is a conservative Catholic party. He thought this was to be a goodwill gesture. So Hitler only served, I think, 9 months out of his 5-year sentence. There were certain restrictions placed on him. He couldn't speak in public, okay, which was probably the most serious way you could insult Hitler. But he was at least back. The thing is, the other thing I'll point out here about the Nazi Party, between 1924 and 1928, okay, this is the period. Where was the Nazi Party? In the 1928 elections, it got slightly more than 2% of the popular vote, about 2.4% of the popular vote. Enough to elect 12 deputies to a Reichstag of over 500 members. In 1928, no one had anything to fear from Hitler. Okay, he wasn't doing he was talking a lot, but he wasn't, maybe he was spending time and money on building up the organization, who knows, but he wasn't a big player. And the only thing that made Hitler a player was eventually the world economic crisis and its impact upon Germany. That's what transformed Hitler from a clown into.
So this sort of goes with that question. In your assessment, was Hitler a lucky, opportunist gambler in his rise to power, or some scholars have asserted, or instead a masterful and skilled planner?
I think he was a little of both. I mean, he was a skilled planner, particularly, and he was he didn't leave things up to chance. He would take things in hand, sometimes wisely and sometimes not so.
But also a gambler in the sense of an opportunity would arise and he didn't spend a lot of time pondering what to do. He seized it.
He had a sort of attitude. Sometimes gambler's the right, it's all or nothing. And he was willing to risk nothing, so that to take that chance that turned out in order to keep his options alive.
Could you address the Reichstag fire and its results?
Sure. Well, to introduce the idea, within a month of Hitler becoming chancellor, the Reichstag, the parliament building, mysteriously caught fire in the middle of the night and became unusable. The fire was put out. They arrested a young Dutchman affiliated with the Communist Party, not particularly capable or talented on his own. The Nazis never let a crisis go to chance, whether or not they were involved in the creation of the crisis or not. and got an Article 48 decree called the Reichstag Fire Decree that essentially, in the face of this emergency, which was portrayed as the communists this is their first step in overthrowing the government, suspended all civil liberties, made the spreading of rumors equivalent to treason, and opened up the door to the persecution and arrest of many of the opponents of the new government, particularly the communists.
Yeah. But the thing I point out, I mean, the fire itself, there is, I mean, no one knows today exactly how it started. Okay. They know they found this drunk Dutchman in the basement, but and there's no impelling evidence that Hitler or the Nazis caused the fire. They may have, but we haven't seen the evidence, to make that kind of argument. So there remains a bit of an unsolved mystery. But everything else Dean says is absolutely right. Hitler moved very quickly to use the fire as an opportunity to consolidate power.
And to illustrate that, there's a story in William Sheridan Allen's book, The Nazi Seizure of Power, about a school where a fifth grade boy announced to his class, well, of course, the Nazis lit the fire. And this is in the days after the fire occurred, right? Who else would have done it? And the principal of the school expelled the boy. This is sort of this preemptive acquiescence, preemptive conformity, because the fire decree was out there and the principal wasn't going to allow his school to be at risk from some kid spreading rumors. So a little illustrative story.
Okay, this one's this could be interesting. Do you ascribe to the belief of not drawing comparisons between today and Nazi Germany, or do you see signs of similarities?
I assume the now refers to the US.
Yes.
I think you have to be very careful. I think the situations are different. I think that you have to remember that Germany's democratic institutions were weak from the very beginning. It was the Weimar Republic, in many respects, was an experiment in democracy, and it didn't work for a variety of reasons, many of which were economic and fiscal. But it also had to do with the fact that it didn't have really maybe more than 55, 56, 60% of the support of the people when it was founded originally in 1918, 19. I think American institutions are much stronger, more resilient. We'll see whether they can withstand. I also, it's hard to understand if no one knows what Trump's intentions are. But he doesn't, I don't think, I think the Nazi movement from certainly once Hitler had taken power, but even before in its steps to gain power, was a very tightly organized organization that worked very effectively, even though Hitler had his own rivals within the party. That did not, so the party was a lot different from what you see going on today here.
To the extent that it's worth drawing comparisons, what you want to look at is any move towards more authoritarian systems. Larry and I have talked about parallels in Turkey and in Hungary, and there's all kinds of different ways, right? There's a book out there called How Democracies Die, looking at not the overthrow in dramatic news, but the undermining of faith in democracy, democratic institutions, so that people can gain more power. And it makes sense. It's not really the topic of this this talk or this series, but it makes sense to look at those more broadly and what are the parallels? How can these moves be channeled, resisted, whatever? How do they function? Hitler's probably not the best model. I think Larry explained that pretty well when you're trying to draw those comparisons. But in the broader scheme,
Yeah, you have to remember Germany had the shock of losing World War One. All right, that started things happening, and then it couldn't get its economy up and running because it had spent so much of its national capital on winning the war. So I think it's a fundamentally different situation because Trump inherited a good economy. We don't know what he's going to do with it yet. I think the two situations are dissimilar. It's important, to understand the differences between the two.
Okay. Hitler was not the only chancellor, so how did his fellow chancellors respond to his confiscation of power?
I think Bruning, who was from the chancellor from 30 to 32, he left Germany in 34. He would have probably been killed in the so-called Night of the Long Knives if he hadn't left Germany. Papen, who followed Bruning, he struck his own separate peace with Hitler and became ambassador to Austria, and then returned after Austria had been annexed by Germany in 38, only to have one of his leading aides in Austria killed by the Nazis in that. So I don't know, Hitler always tolerated Papen, but never took him seriously enough to have him killed.
and then in the Night of the Long Knives, Schleicher was murdered and his wife. So they didn't have much time to react.
How is Crown Prince Wilhelm II's approval of the Nazi Party viewed by the German population, especially after the Crown Prince marched with them in 1933?
I don't know how the German population reacted to the Crown Prince. I don't think people took him seriously any longer. He was sort of a clown, regarded as such. His father, who was still alive at that time, had disgraced himself by fleeing to Holland at the end of the war. And I don't think there's always sort of a monarchist group in Germany afterwards, but it is relatively small, relatively insignificant. It belonged to the Nationalist Party and never played a very important role in the Nazi movement.
Okay.
And I have the sense that the monarchists really longed for Wilhelm to come back, not for his son to fill that seat.
Just keep getting more questions. Okay. What, if any, was the state of anti-Semitism during these periods?
That is a very good question. That is a very good question. I will try to. Okay. The end of the World War One was accompanied by an increase in anti-Semitism, particularly as the government tried to blame Germany's defeat on someone other than themselves. All right. It didn't work because Jews had served in the German army during World War One at a higher percentage than non-Jews, okay, and had suffered higher rates of casualty, death than other groups. Yes.
Although the government wouldn't release the statistics,
They
so
wouldn't
rumors.
They didn't release the statistics, and in fact, the army came up with this plan in 1917 when it seemed that the war might not go as well as they wanted it to. That would blame Germany's defeat on the Jews. Okay. Now, there is a dramatic sort of, I say in the Second Empire, anti-Semitism was always there, but Jews were accepted. Jews were in the government, certainly in banking and in business. They had already established themselves, okay, as a respectable element of German society. All right. But that begins to change as a result of Germany's defeat in World War One There's a dramatic increase of anti-Semitism between 1920 and 1924. You can see that in a number of different ways. But then once the Republic seems to stabilize itself in 24, okay, there's a short period of stability. 20 that anti-Semitism begins to die down. Okay, it played virtually no role whatsoever in the 1928 Reichstag elections, and then Wall Street lays its egg. The German economy collapses fast, quickly, and who you look for someone to blame, and the Jews are blamed, and so there is a dramatic sort of increase in anti-Semitism that begins in 1930. It's hard to say how many Germans took that seriously. We don't have any real data on that kind of thing, but certainly there's a it begins to I don't know enough about that last period just to say how many people they're not taking public opinion polls or anything like that. You can see it probably in the increase in the Nazi vote between 1930 and 1932. It's one of the contributing factors.
One of the interesting things about Hitler's campaigns in 32 is he stopped playing up the Nazi Party's anti-Semitism to make himself more respectable. It was, of course, resonating. People knew the Nazis represented anti-Semitism, so anti-Semites would be drawn there. But his campaign did not stress it. He was elected as the savior of Germany from the Depression and its humiliation. And then, when in power, all that deep ideological anti-Semitism blossomed is the wrong word.
Well, exploded.
Exploded.
And early in 1933, you can see Jews were being beaten up on the streets as early as March and April of 1933.
I think it might be time
Well,
for
one last question, because they just want you to mention the title of the book about democracy dying or ending that you referenced.
Oh, it's literally called How Democracies Die. And the authors are Levitsky and Zilblatt, right.
Okay.
Zilblatt.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you both. Thank you for Thank you for being with us today. We want to send a huge thank you to our academics, Dr. Larry Jones, Dr. Dean Pavlakis. They were exceptional. And if you still have questions that were not answered, I'm sure you could email them and we would be happy to have them answered for you. We invite you to join us on September 16th at noon Pacific time for the next webinar of What History Teaches: Scapegoating and the Politics of Others, hosted by the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, and it will be led by Dr. Beth Reich-Pallel. It will explore how the Nazis used fear, nationalism, and anti-Semitism to target Jewish people and other minorities. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Good job.